Okay. I think we should start. This evening, again, it's something of a kind of experiment in that we've asked Andrew Benjamin to give a lecture this evening, but for it really to set the stage for a kind of number of lectures, indeed for a kind of lecture series, but which is compressed into this week and early next week. So this evening's lecture will be followed at 5 o'clock each evening by a lecture and a seminar and a chance for people to kind of respond and to question Andrew, who will be here for the week and a bit, and as always is extremely generous and will, I'm sure, make time to talk to those students who would like. In a sense, originally the course which he's going to give was designed principally and aimed at the students on the MA and History and Theory, but we're really trying to kind of find ways and means in kind of which the concerns of that course can, in a sense, be exported to the school more generally. And it's a question, I think, of finding what forms are best for that. It isn't just a cliche to say that Andrew Benjamin needs no introduction. For many years, he's been part and parcel of the school, lecturing in architectural kind of theory and theoretical historical issues, but also taking a very active role in the design side of the school, in juries, and perhaps especially kind of overlooking, if not overseeing, the theoretical development of the DRL. And as always, it's a great pleasure to welcome him, and we hope that he enjoys his stay with us as much as we will of him being here. Andrew.
Thank you very much, and as always, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. The paper I'm going to read today is in part drawn from a book that I've just almost, well, I like to think I've almost completed, called Style and Time. Someone else wrote a book called Being and Time, so I thought I'd do Style and Time. The point of the book is orientated around one particular historical moment, which I argue, and here I'm merely going to state it, marks the emergence of the question of modern architecture and the question of the appearance of modern architecture. And I'll present some of the detail of the argument. Let me just state it in advance. This occurs in the late 1820s. It's announced by a pamphlet written by Heinrich Hubsch, which is called In welchem Stil sollen wir bauen? In what style ought we, sollen, ought we to build? And the very fact that this title of this pamphlet has a question mark starts the German style debate. And I'll come back to this, but I take this pamphlet as marking the question, marking the emergence of the appearance of modern architecture as a question, which I will try and show over the next few days of these lectures, but try and show it in brief today, why that's a central question for the question of design. And believe it or not, the debates of the 19th century are overlooked because they're too quickly transformed into a conception of architectural history and theory that's orientated around the plan and on the elevation and not around materials. And actually what the German style debate is all about the relationship between architecture as realized through material possibilities, which is indeed our concern at the moment. But for the first instance, what I want to do is give you, in some sense, the historical and philosophical background to this as an argument. The insistence on the autonomy of architecture indeed on the autonomy of any space defined by a complex relation between discourse, practice and history, means that the question of how to write within it has an acuity that would vanish if autonomy were to be refused. However, rather than insist on autonomy as being self-evident, it can be approached initially from the other direction. The question, therefore, is what does it mean for that autonomy to have been given up? Of the many ways this can occur, one of the most more pervasive has to do with the image. While it will always be true that architecture is inextricably bound up with the means of its own representation, it does not follow from the truth of that presupposition that architecture is either coterminous with its representation or has to be understood within the framework of representation. In addition, the reduction of architecture to its image precludes emphasis being given to a connection between the history of architecture and the history of material possibility. While an image can be of matter at work, that is one possibility announced now by the image's inherently overdetermined nature. And it strikes me more and more, both in academic contexts or even in juries, when PowerPoint is used to show something on the screen, the question I think we all should ask is, what am I being invited to look at? Sure, it's an image, but of what is it an image? Am I asked to see matter at work? Is this simply a representation? What is the status of the image? And once the question of the status of the image can be asked, then that concedes immediately that the image is overdetermined. It means more than one thing. But equally it indicates that architecture is not reducible to that image. So it behoves architectural students and the rest of us to actually answer the question, what are you inviting me to look at? The common practice that juxtaposes images that are external to architecture with ostensibly architectural ones in order that the former illuminate the latter will invariably reduce architecture to the status not just of an image, but equally to its own image. As such, architecture would have become no more than the image of architecture. If the problematic element is this reduction, and thus the hold of the image, what is it like to turn this position around, to concede the complexity of the image? This would occur not by banning the image, but incorporating the image within the field itself. The initial question, therefore, concerns the status of the image within autonomy. While it can be argued for in detail, in this context, autonomy will be developed in terms of what I want to call a material event. This material event is the moment at which geometry, program, and the work of materials are interconnected. And yet that cannot be all. Once the term event is introduced, then what has to be acknowledged is the possibility of singularity. Not the singularity of the idiosyncratic, but a conception of the singular in which the specific interconnection between geometry, program, and materials resists any form of generality, except as an abstraction, and thus as a diagram. Understood in this sense, the material event can define autonomy as much as architecture's potential for criticality. To the extent that architecture becomes the work of matter, a work having an inherently immaterial dimension, then criticality would not be adduced. Its presence would form part of the practice of the event, a forming thought beyond the opposition of the instrumental and the decorative, the latter re-emerging lamentably by the use of the word cool. Furthermore, what is opened up here is the general problem of what counts as experimentation and research in architecture. It might be necessary, in order to answer this question, to distinguish between experimentation for architecture and experimentation in architecture. The latter concedes the necessity, again, for autonomy. In regards to the former, experimentation for architecture, it is clear that experiments by engineers and software manufacturers who, working together, have created a range of materials that makes an important addition to architecture. The question of the nature of that addition, or the incorporation of such developments, becomes a way of understanding this second sense of experimentation. Furthermore, it indicates why collaboration between engineers and architects is fundamental, rather than the expectation that the architect can resolve in advance questions of materials. But once materials are moved into the realm of architecture, then what we're interested in is research in that domain, and again, that signals autonomy. Equally, it indicates, or this would be the argument, that the second form of experimentation is inextricably bound up with what has been identified here as the material event. The image within autonomy will need to be understood as a beginning as the image of a material event. So what you're being invited to see is that relationship. Well, that's the opening that provides the setting for the general argument. If this formulation becomes the point of departure, there has to be a contemporary setting in which the question of the appearance of modern architecture and its relation to the image will acquire relevance. Any further discussion of detail, ornamentation, decoration, etc., can only be posed after that setting is established. It will not have relevance simply in being posed. Here, the setting will be the German style debate that occurs in the 19th century and which defines how the discursive practice of architecture, at least in that context, is then constructed. In order to show how emphatic that opening is and how it recasts the nature of architecture's autonomy, two specific moments will be taken. Now, this may seem fabulously academic, but do bear with me. It is, I believe, relevant. The first is the way Winckelmann sets the debate. Winckelmann is the great theorist of 18th century German theorist of architecture who writes the famous book on the history of architecture, the Antike Baukunst book. The first is the way Winckelmann sets the scene for the debate by defining the appearance of architecture in terms of imitation or mimesis, a term inextricably bound up with architecture as a representation. This occurs with a concomitant stilling of the image within the demand that it represent. The second is that the debate's inception involves the refusal of this conception of imitation occurring in Hübsch, and how that refusal is then linked to an investigation of material possibility. In other words, historically, the move to materials occurs at the same time as there's the refusal to see architecture as imitative. Prior to noting more of their detail, a further point needs to be made in relation to autonomy. Even if arguments concerning autonomy are accepted, there is a danger of essentializing autonomy and thus turning it into a timeless category. While autonomy will allow architecture to have a history, that history cannot be understood as determined by timeless considerations and eternal categories of evaluation, judgment, let alone of ideal geometries. In other words, autonomy cannot be posited as though it functions as an end in itself. The question of what gives autonomy its particularity, what makes architecture architecture at a given period, is not only contestable, but has to be understood as the site of an internal contestation and conflict. The history of the architecture is a history of the conflict over the nature of the practice of architecture. Allowing for autonomy is not to argue that architecture is always one and the same. Nor finally does autonomy mean a complete differentiation from wider cultural or political concerns. On the contrary, autonomy signals the very possibility and thus the way such concerns will be present within the activity of architecture. In a text of 1818, Antique und Modern, Goethe asserts in relation to the contested heritage of Greece that, and I quote, "Everyone should be Greek in his own manner, but he should be Greek." The question of modern architecture, to put it brutally, is how not to be Greek. While this nuances the position of Winckelmann, to whom it would be necessary to return, it is a position that is far more equivocal than the emphatic question posed by Heinrich Hübsch only 10 years later. Hübsch's pamphlet, which inaugurated the debate on style, is entitled, as I said, "In welchem Stil sollen wir bauen?" In what style ought we to build? Question mark. Even though he will provide an answer to his own question with the introduction, perhaps reintroduction of Rundbogenstil, it remains the case that the decisive element in the title are the demands stemming from the interplay of the sollen, the ought, and the question mark. What, after all, is the relationship between a demand, almost an obligation, and its incorporation into a question? The straightforward position is that the answer is to be determined. It's not given in advance, hence the question mark. The fact that Hoopes can answer his own question is not the point. The answer lacks necessity. It is this quality that will allow for a return to the question of the relationship between style and appearance. For Winckelmann, the connection was given. There was no question. Nothing was to be determined. What is at stake in regards to both Winckelmann and Hoopes is the interplay between historical time, a conception of time which, in this instance, discloses the vexed question of the advent of modernity, and mimesis. The latter, mimesis, has to be understood reciprocally as involving a theory of imitation that is inextricably bound up with the question of time, and thus the question of historical time. It is in this light that it is possible to turn to Winckelmann's pamphlet on the imitation of paintings and sculptures of the Greeks. Now, I don't want to comment on the work in its entirety. I want to focus on two elements. The first is the use of the term imitation, of mimesis, and the second is the role played by Raphael in his overall analysis. While this may seem a preoccupation that has too great a distance from the question of the appearance of modern architecture, part of what I want to argue here is that it is the move from Winckelmann to Hoopes, that the framework emerges in which it will become possible to pose the question, what is the appearance of modern architecture, where that endures as the question guiding our response to modern architecture. More significantly, of course, it means that it can be posed in a way that the answer remains open. Both of these elements are decisive when what is at stake is the appearance of modern architecture. It is essential to recognize, as I've said, that the key term is imitation. In his essay, Winckelmann writes, and I quote, "There is but one way for the moderns to become great, and perhaps unequalled, I mean by imitating the ancients." End quote. While this is the favored strategy, it is vital to be clear what is meant by imitation. And you'll see that what is meant by imitation has to do with form linked to an idea. The answer to this question will emerge from a brief consideration of the role of Raphael. Winckelmann quotes Raphael, writing to Count Baldassare Castiglione in regards to his Galatea. Raphael writes, quoted by Winckelmann, and I quote, "Beauty being so seldom found amongst the fair, I avail myself of a certain Einbildung, of a certain ideal image." What is interesting is that the Platonic problem of moving from the ideal to its realization is absent from Raphael's epistolary formulation of his methodology, as well as the use made of it by Winckelmann. This absence opens up the question of how imitation is to be understood. Winckelmann goes on to identify the presence of the ideal in, for example, and I quote, "that the profile of the brow and the noses of the gods and goddesses is almost a straight line. What is imitated is line, and more generally, though specifically, is contour." And again, this becomes, interesting if you run this as a general historical argument, that the idea of the line responding to the ideal has a history within architecture that's still there in the way certain geometries are talking about. To me, the other pivotal text, though outside architecture, that's fundamental for this is Baudelaire. Baudelaire is the last theorist of the pre-modern. When Baudelaire argues that the contemporary is simply the present form of the ideal, he wrestles with the possibility that there could be something called the modern, there could be something called modernity, but it's still the contemporary form taken by the ideal. The real problem of modernity ends, and that's why we have a question, is when ideals no longer regulate appearances. So to me, Baudelaire becomes this pivotal figure at the end of the modern, because once there is no ideal governing what appears, the question of appearance emerges as a real question. Otherwise, you always have recourse back to the ideal. Now, when Winckelmann uses the word contour, contour as the object and the source of imitation always stands above nature. Contour will allows the move from the individual element to the whole, then the practice of the particular work. For Winckelmann, this is the source of Raphael's greatness, though equally it was the limit of Michelangelo. The movement in which contour and expression, Ausdruck, come to be connected involves a reinscription of the ideal. Rather than the ideal being a transcendent quality and as such unattainable and unpresentable, it is located in a sense of the appropriate. Note the way Winckelmann plots the effect of parenthyreusos, which is a ancient Greek word meaning the excessive, a term from Longinus used to plot excess in relation to character. Excess becomes that which is inappropriate. The possibility of excess will lead to arguments for decorum, as that which will preclude all of the detrimental effects that result from allowing excess presence. The clear example from the history of architecture the history of sculpture rather, is Laocoon. In Laocoon, suffering alone has been excessive. The artists need to be the control of excess. I quote, "The artists, therefore, in order to reconcile the significant and ennobling qualities of his soul, put him into a posture allowing for the sufferings that were necessary, the next to a state of tranquility. A tranquility, however, that is characteristical. The soul will be herself, this individual, not the soul of mankind, sedate but active, calm but not indifferent or drowsy." So at the end of the 18th century, there was always a question of the appropriate governing appearance, but it was a question of the appropriate that was always linked to ideal forms. We could translate that. Ideal forms become the plan, become the 9 squares, become geometries. They're always ideals that are external to a presentation, but equally are always indifferent to the quality of the materials and the specificity of the materials involved. So for Winckelmann, propriety understood as the appropriate pertains to that which is proper to character, rather than to a transcendental ideal form. Ideals for Winckelmann can be instantiated. This achievement marks for Winckelmann the work of Raphael. This opens up the complexity within the proposition that greatness in art is found in imitating the Greeks. What was imitated had to do with the relationship between soul and line, a relationship that even if the colours of the original fade, is there in the enduring presence of the soul. Now interesting, the German philosopher Schelling commented on exactly this passage from Winckelmann. Schelling comments on this passage. He argues that as an expression of the soul, Ausdruck der Seele, it is not drawn from experience. What is expressed, therefore, is an idea that transcends nature. Schelling both confirms the inherent idealism of Winckelmann, though also makes it clear that paintings can express ideals. Contemporary practice, therefore, works in relation to a predetermined space of evaluation. Winckelmann is able to judge, and the ground of judgment is a found sense of propriety that has to be imitated. Precisely because it is imitation, rather than simple copying, it is possible to see a line between the Greeks and Raphael. However, it is a line that is determined by continuity. What this means is that while there may be unexpected forms that will allow contour expression, or at least that is a potential whose elimination is impossible, the drawing of a line must be continually guided by a founding sense of the appropriate. This is not nostalgia for the Greeks in any simple sense, nor is it a claim that Raphael is Greek. It is an argument for the continuance of a conception of style that regulates appearance. In other words, in my argument, it's precisely the pre-modern. It's the moment in which modernity is yet to be announced, because there is no severance of style and appearance. It's regulated by the retention of ideals. Now, which I just would add, and this is not to say that even in modernity there can't be gestures back to the ideals. Of course there can be. But now, because of the force of Hübsch's question, in what style ought we to build, it's contestable. Prior to Hübsch, the ideals dominated, it wasn't contestable. With Hübsch, it becomes contestable, and therefore one can have a retention of ideals, but it's almost a stylistic recidivism. But it's equally part of the modern. The criteria of regulation, as I said, is given in advance. While appearance may not be determined in advance, hence the distinction between imitation and simple copying, the question of style is always resolved. And again, historically, it's very interesting. In the English context, if you go to Reynolds writes
wrestles with the problem of imitation versus plagiarism. And it's a very interesting moment in the history of aesthetic theory where plagiarism emerges as a real problem. And it emerges as a real problem, not a moral issue, but an aesthetic issue, a stylistic issue. Precisely if to be great is to imitate the Greeks. How do you distinguish that from plagiarism? And so Reynolds wrestles with this, and Hazlitt, in developing his critique of Reynolds, does so precisely around the question of plagiarism. And if there is a correlate to Hoopsch in the English context, as it were, it's the never read Hazlitt, who clearly, I believe, ought to be read, because that's that moment in which all of a sudden idealism within the history of English aesthetic theory is countered, and it's countered around the question of plagiarism. That's another story. So Raphael's not Greek. While appearance may not be determined in advance, as I said, the question of style is always resolved in advance. The resolution is given within the structure of imitation, the structure of mimesis. As a structure, it establishes the relationship between line in colour, in general appearance, and the ideal. The ideal is always given within the work and articulated, at least for Winckelmann, in terms of the relationship between contour and expression. This other defining element of the structure is time. The question of style is resolved through the activity of imitation, an activity that is itself only possible because of a conception of historical time thought in terms of continuity. That's why there's no problem for Winckelmann. We just go on forever imitating the Greeks, because historical time is continuous. Were that continuity not to pertain, and this would mark either a specific moment or a specific work, there will still not be a sustained loss. The continuity can be recovered. Other possibly future works will enact it. Such acts of recovery would be further evidence for why the question of style will always have been determined in advance. In sum, imitation, in the sense in which it is used by Winckelmann, is as much a temporal category as it is one linked to the production of works. Appearance will always be regulated by the interplay of time and imitation. In addition, the appropriate, a term whose conceptual content will have a fundamental role within the style debate once Berticher's Die Tektonik der Hellenen is published in 1852, in the hands of Winckelmann is never discussed in terms of the quality of material as being appropriate to the realization of a project. To write of that level of the appropriate would have been to gesture towards a rethinking of material presence in terms of what has already been identified as a material event. Now, this is the setting in which Hoopsch's pamphlet in Welchem Stil Sollen wir bauen needs to be read. While Hoopsch's own relation to the Navarrene school needs to be noted, a historical contextualization would locate him as part of that movement. The pamphlet escapes this historical reduction, and in escaping that historical reduction has a sort of Überleben, a Nachleben, and lives again as something prompting design, or a prompt for design. The pamphlet could not open with a more emphatic diagnosis of the current condition of creation. His language repeats Winckelmann's. One has to do this, like, let's for a moment have the thought experiment. Imagine we're Germans. Imagine we're living in 1828, and you've been reading Winckelmann, and all of a sudden, through the mail, Hoopsch's pamphlet arrives. And you find the first sentence of Hoopsch's pamphlet is using exactly the same language as Winckelmann, but always turned round. The shock would be astonishing. And all of a sudden, you as an 1828 German would notice that something remarkable has occurred in the history of thinking. The pamphlet begins, and using again Winckelmann's exact formulations. Painting and sculpture, this is quoting Hoopsch, painting and sculpture have long since abandoned the lifeless imitation of antiquity. Don't forget, Winckelmann's saying that life comes from imitation and the imitation of antiquity. Hoopsch goes on, architecture has yet to come of age and continues to imitate the antique style. So there's the Sollen, the ought. Architects have to grow up, come of age. They have to give up the prop of imitation. And with this, I believe, something remarkable occurs in the history of the way architecture conceives of itself. And that act of self-conception is clearly part of architecture's autonomy. What is significant about this formulation is the positioning of architecture as outside the modern. It has yet to come of age, Hoopsch writes, and by that position being defined in relation to style. Once identified in these terms, the range of possible responses is set up in advance. This attempt to break the determining hold of imitation is, of course, a recurrent motif. It occurs in its most emphatic form in those conceptions of the modern that ground the modern's inception in an inaugurating interruption. And one has to here think absolutely of Hölderlin's theoretical writings to see in what way this same mode of thinking is occurring outside of architecture. This rethinking of the present has to be understood as a conception of modernity, basing the present on the idea of a founding interruption. Hoopsch's pamphlet finishes with a restatement of the contemporary dilemma, and hence the contemporary obligation of and for architecture. I quote, "In every case, buildings logically designed in their basic element will rank much higher as works of art, even with the most infelicitous decorations, than the most exact imitations of ancient art. Now, better something badly done than to simply imitate the Greeks. A badly done modern version announces its relation of distance to Greeks because it cannot be understood, to Greek art, because it cannot be understood within the structure of imitation and therefore can't be judged in relation to it. So what occurs is a shift in the categories of judgment. At the center of his argumentation is the twofold move in which the activity of the imagination comes to be championed, at the same time as a simple miming of ancient styles is put to one side. As such, style comes to the fore as a question. However, coupled to its presence as a question is the necessity to control the excesses of the imagination. This again is exactly what you find in Hölderlin's Poetics about the relationship between measure and the measureless. The measureless, sure, but there has to be measure. There has to be the control of the imagination. In other words, what this early formulation of the question of style stages is the need to avoid the idiosyncratic. The latter is present as a possibility precisely because the idiosyncratic is one of those eventualities that cannot be precluded once there is a break between the present and a sense of continuity that would have been guaranteed by imitation. And if you think about Benjamin's critique of Jugendstil, his critique is that it simply becomes idiosyncratic. And the extent to which Benjamin knows this work, I doubt, but it's certainly, you see here echoes in Benjamin's critique of Jugendstil, which becomes the idiosyncratic. The point is, what's interesting is the idiosyncratic is an option once there is the severance of style and appearance. So the idiosyncratic has to be read, as it were, as a symptom. So the idiosyncratic is present, as I said, as a possibility because of this break. Now, Bertiche's contribution to the debate, both in the book noted above, in the Tectonics of the Greeks, and in his pamphlet on Schinkel, 1846, reinforces the impossibility of defining style in terms of individual aspirations. There needs to be a break with that. However, neither that move nor the redefinition of style in terms of tectonic possibilities can be taken as ends in themselves. They are tied up with another element. And it's the other interesting thing that emerges. The question of style in this context becomes the national question. In the first instance, this will be the defining way of avoiding particularity. If there's no idea to control appearance, then because it appears, it must be recognized as an appearance. The one who recognizes as an appearance once generalized is the people, is the nation. This will account for why Bertiche will argue in regards to style that, and I quote, "only a whole nation can cause its inception," end quote. Moreover, a style may take an epoch for its development. Not only is style, therefore, in this context tied to the question of nation, it is equally part of the nation's natural history, recognizing, of course, the artifice of this nature. And yet, of course, it is the linking of tectonics and style which, once the predicament of the modern is understood as the severance of style and appearance, that allows the question of tectonics to be rethought in terms of material possibilities. In other words, the severance of style and appearance, the fact that there is nothing to imitate anymore, we break with the Greeks, means that the style must have a unified quality. That's the dilemma. One way, historically, that's understood is by linking style to the national question. The other way that's understood is by linking style to material possibilities. And these two moments cross and intersect in the last half of the 19th century, the earlier half of the 20th century, as I'll indicate. What emerges is a complex state of affairs in which the break with imitation allows both for the national question to be part of modernity, while linking that relation to the work of materials. That link brings the national into consideration, and yet while being brought into relation, it allows at the same time architecture to divest itself of the national question. And I mean, again, if you want more detail, just to make the case, what happens in the same period, a very important theorist of architectural history and art history, Riegel, develops a conception of Kunstwollen. And Kunstwollen is, if you like, the will to art. It's art showing something external to it within its materiality. However, this idealist position is countered by Semper and the materialists in terms of Kunstwerk. And Kunstwerk is the material presence of the relationship between Kernform and Werkform, between the structural members and architecture's materiality. So at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, there's this debate between the idealism of Kunstwollen, where the will to art is always of an idea external, and Kunstwerk, which says there is an ideational content. It is more than just mere matter, but that ideational content has to do with the appropriate relationship between appearance and the materials used to construct the work. Once Riegel's conception of Kunstwollen becomes Kunstwerk, a position championed by both Bertischer and Semper, then architecture's ideational content is a structural and hence a material concern. In other words, the impossibility of maintaining continuity through mime, and of there having to be a break within natural time, a break that constitutes the modern, once articulated within a concern with style, becomes in the first instance forms of the national question, while locating that insistence in structural presence. While Bertischer will at a given moment connect style and nationhood, the break with imitation allows for style to have a projective, if not futural, quality. It may be, therefore, that the use of style and ornament will project a nation's self-conception, not the nation at hand, but the nation to come. This should not be seen as an aberrant possibility, but as another way through the predicament of modernity, once the latter is understood as a break, once a return cannot be made, and once continuity is no longer an option, then the question of how to continue, as I've tried to argue, cannot be avoided. This is the locus within which the question of style emerges. And again, one final example, though I don't have a slide of this, the defining moment of this, I mean, the last pre-modern architect, though once I give you the dates, you'll realize how sort of scandalous thing this is to say, is Plečnik. If you look at the facade of the National Library when viewed from Gosposka Street, what you see are elements that are incoherent. That's why the lamentable postmodernists thought he was one of them. What you see is Etruscan vases, Italianate sculptures of Moses in the style of the Italians. You see Ionic pillars. You see things that are incoherent. You see a Wagner surface, but interrupted by Slovenian peasant form, where the smooth Wagnerian surface is interrupted by brick, gesturing as much to the modern as to the vernacular. All of this is incoherent, except when you recognize that Plečnik believed that Slovenian identity was that of a Mediterranean people. They should turn their back on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, look to the Mediterranean. This nationality to come, this identity to come, is there staged by the architecture. Forget that concept of nationhood, because it's inconceivable that we moderns believe in an essentialist conception of nationhood. Forget that. The facade is incoherent, because these only cohere because of that conception of national identity. Plečnik's facade on the National Library is the last moment of symbolic architecture. Therefore, the problem we have is what happens afterwards with the symbol. But what is interesting is that, given that the organizing idea has vanished, how do we begin to understand what modern architecture should appear? If there are no styles, no organizing ideals which are unified for architecture to enact, what does architecture enact? The complex relationship between style and national identity continues to define how style is understood throughout the early part of the 20th century. In, for example, the lecture Kunst und Technik given by Peter Behrens in 1910, the two terms are still defined in relation to each other. I quote Behrens, "By style we mean the unified formal expression," and again it's the word Formausdruck, it's all about expression, "the manifestation of an entire spiritual life of an epoch, Unified character, not the particular or the peculiar, is the decisive factor. So again, even 1910, even Behrens, what we need is a unified conceptual identity for architecture to show. There are 2 points that need to be made here. The first is that the interarticulation of style and the national question is a consequence of the interruption that signals the presence of the modern, and which is announced in architectural terms by the severance of the immediate connection between style and appearance. The second is that it is due to this severance that the link between style and the national question does not exhaust the question of style, simply because that link is merely a contingent relation. The presence of that contingency entails that the appearance of modern architecture remains a question whose answer is always to be determined. Moreover, the subsequent recasting of the modern as so-called international style also becomes another contingent connection. What this means is, of course, that international style simply replaced the national. Therefore, to the extent that there needs to be a critique of the identification of the modern with the international, this cannot occur by a return to the national, nor even in Frampton's sentimental attachment to place. While it is not possible to pursue it in this context, what emerges is an opening. Between the national and the international, both of which can be understood as responses to the question of style, there arises another formulation of both style and place. Developing it means giving serious attention to the question of what a cosmopolitan architectural style would be. And what I want to argue in lectures to come is that the cosmopolitan is, to use modern language, the term that will deconstruct the opposition between the national and the international, and then becomes a way that transfigures not simply the question of appearance, but the question of place, because architecture takes place and takes a place. Insisting on this to-be-determined quality works within the severance of style and appearance. However, it does so by linking present practice to a futural dimension. The future is, of course, always played out in and as the present. It's only the weakness of utopian thinking that posits a future. The future should always be a condition of the present. Posed in these terms, the question of modern architecture, once articulated within the cosmopolitan, moves architecture beyond the image, while still allowing for the image of architecture. Any response must allow for a complex interplay of design procedures, materials, and a reconfiguration of site, part of what I've referred to before as a material event, to be central within any determination of how the cosmopolitan would appear. And yet it will never just be one appearance, never just be one mere image, since the movement between design and its realization, the relations between geometry and materials, and finally the transformation of the site such that the geography becomes architectural, all raise the question of appearance, because not only are they the consequence of the ineliminability as a question, it is also the case that appearance, architectural's material presence, will have a modality that cannot have been determined in advance, hence the lapse that is prototyping. This is the legacy bequeathed to design, not just to history, to design by the interruptive force of Hoopsch's question, posed in 1828. Almost there. The question of appearance begins to define, therefore, the problem of modern architecture. In the following, an outline will be given as to how, from within the history of architecture, that question has come to have an inherent complexity. In sum, the problem emerges once the modern is defined, if only as a beginning, as the space created by the severance of style and appearance. Now, what I want to do is just give you very, very briefly, super quickly, the structure as to the historical problem which I'm going to address over the next 3 or 4 days. Now, the first moment is found in the work of Emil Kaufmann. Kaufmann's incisive, if slightly polemical work of 1933, Von Ledoux bis Le Corbusier, takes as its point of orientation that with Ledoux, the Verband, the concatenation, that determined the Baroque. Now here we have our first slide. There are only 3 slides. Here's the first one. Evidence, for example, in Albertina 175A, one of Borromini's most important drawings for San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, is definitively at its end. And what the Baroque concatenation is, and those of you who know me just ignore my obsession with Borromini, is, I'm not tall enough to do this, but if you take column, wall, bay, and you take this as a dense line that carries all the elements of architecture with it,
these elements are not autonomous, one in relation to the other. They're all distributed by this line. And when I will talk at the very last lecture about another quirky guy, Frederick Kiesler, and draw a connection between the work of Kiesler and Knox and Borromini, not to indicate that Kiesler and Knox are Borromini at all, but to make the, well, not Baroque at all, but to make the argument that these individuated elements are individuated by a line. The line that is continuous individuates the discontinuous. And what I take the verbum, the concatenation to be, the diagram of the concatenation, is that individual elements are individuated by a line. So finitude has the infinite as its presupposition. And that's what I take the diagram of the Baroque to be. And that's what, and this is the Borromini drawing. Now for Kaufmann, on one level quite rightly, that with Ledoux, and I'll show in a minute, something dramatically ends. What emerges is this project for Kaufmann is over with Ledoux, and specifically, I'll give you the example, is the plan of show. You just show the next slide. Now, what show, in the plan of show indicates is three levels of autonomy. One is an autonomy that, as Damisch and others have indicated, is linked to the autonomy of reason and Kant. In other words, it's the internally regulative. It's no longer gesturing to an external to regulate the internal. But equally, visually, there are two other levels of autonomy. One is that the block is always autonomous in relation to another block. And equally, if you take the very top of this slide to be green, and this part of the slide to be not green, what you'd see is that it's autonomous in relation to nature. So you have three levels of autonomy. One, gesturing towards Kant's autonomy of reason. The other, that always we have questions of relationality. Relationality has to do with things that are ab initio discontinuous, and therefore we ask the question of how do we make them continuous, which is the question of the other person, the autonomous question of the Enlightenment. But equally, we have autonomous in relation to nature. The other thing I would indicate about this is the absence of any concept of the infinite. Namely, that what you see has the ontology of the moment. This is it. There is no design. The design question is, can we do an urbanism in which 10, 15, 20 years down the line, other things become possible? Then clearly, whatever I show you now cannot be an image or a representation of that. This is precisely a representation of the moment that is all. That's sort of the banality of utopian thinking, particularly the problem of utopian thinking. It shows you it's all complete. So this, for Kaufmann, ends the Baroque concatenation because of these senses of autonomy. But to put it in more theoretical terms, what this shows is that in the 17th century there are two senses of the infinite. An infinite of addition, A plus B plus C plus D, forever. Infinite addition. There's the other notion of the infinite that you find, for example, in Leibniz's definition of the point, which is that through which there is a concurrence of an infinite number of lines. Or the structure of calculus, where the boom boom, you set up parameters through which there's an infinite series of permutations. In other words, the infinite is always internal. Now that notion of an internal infinite cannot be represented. There can be no image of the internal infinite. Now, this break that Kaufmann identifies with Borrominian concatenation, there is a decisive break, is more than a change, however, on the level of the image. As Kaufmann argues in a later work, forms recur, systems don't. For Kaufmann, therefore, the Baroque as a system, and not just as an image, but as a system, comes to an end with Ledoux. In addition, the move from Ledoux to modernism is an occasion by the refusal of the Baroque and an insistence on autonomy. The position which generates a history of architecture, formulated in terms of a fundamental shift in systematic organisation, makes Colin Rowe's approach to the question of modern architecture such a challenge. Before I mention Rowe, who I'll spend at least one lecture looking at, what's the difficulty with Kaufmann is the question of whether he's right. The interesting thing is that if he weren't right about detail, what he's insisting on is that one writes the history of architecture as the history of innovation. So it's never a sense of worrying about continuity, though there'll always be pivotal figures. The history of architecture becomes the history of innovation. But what I'll try and argue is the major limit of this is not whether it's wrong or right, but it's innovation thought on the level of the plan or the elevation.
innovation. It's never an innovation thought on the levels of material possibility. So it's, as it were, a theory of architectural innovation that's planimetric, that leaves what Böttcher and the Germans recognized in the 19th century as fundamental, that innovation is only possible through shifts and changes in the natures of material possibilities. Now, for Rowe, the dilemma faced by modern architecture is to be located in its problematic relation to Palladio, and thus to what could be described as another version of autonomy. Robin Evans summarizes Rowe's arguments in the following terms. Rowe, and I quote, interpreted the explicit symmetry in Mies's work as a return to the conventions of classicism, end quote. In fact, it was not a return in any straightforward sense. The point for Rowe is that Mies had not been able to escape Palladio. Now, what's so wonderful about Rowe is that it's almost seductive. He says Mies almost does it in the 30s. Almost in the late 20s there is this break with Palladio, but it's like the worst word that you can ever have in a love affair is almost. I almost love you. Rowe says he almost breaks. And that's what I want to look at in great detail as to how this occurs. The point for Rowe is that Mies had not been able to escape Palladio. It appeared as though he might in the work undertaken in the late 20s and early 30s, when the columns come to be articulated through the structure, allowing them to emerge, to use Rowe's terms, as a caesura. Rowe writes that, and I quote, "The column is no more than an interpolation, a caesura in a general space." However, by the time of Crown Hall and Farnsworth, both projects of the 1950s, the German column, understood in terms of a minimum obstruction to a horizontal movement of space, and which led in one direction, a direction away from Palladio, now leads back to him almost. For Rowe, therefore, writing the history of architecture cannot occur in terms of innovations or breaks, even if such a state of affairs are desired. The retained centrality of the block means that they cannot be activated or realized in any direct sense. Kaufmann's insistence on the impossibility that systems can recur, Rowe's pessimism in relation to anything other than the retention of ideal geometries, is a positioning of architecture's history that has to be questioned. The prompt for doing so will come from two directions. The first is the repositioning of the Baroque by Deleuze in Le Pli, where it is no longer taken as designating a historical period, but is repositioned as, and I quote, an operative function. The second is that in broad terms, what guides the interpretations given by Kaufmann and Rowe is a particular sense of architectural representation, which to me seems the crucial point. The history of architecture is presented in terms of the history of the plan and thus the elevation. What does not figure is the plan as a material event, and I'll try and argue that in more detail. There can be no simple championing of Deleuze, however. For example, his contention in Le Pli that, and I quote, "the problem is not how to finish a fold, but how to continue it, to take it to infinity, is a radical limitation of the fold's potential. The limitation is the failure to recognize that what will always be at stake is the move from diagram to material realization. Avoiding the pure formalism in which prototype generates form whose spatial quality in being completely abstract and as such comes to repeat as a negative instance, modernism's form follows function motif, will always concern how to finish the fold and therefore how to establish architectural form. The finite is an interruption. It's precisely what Borromini's drawing shows. The finite is an interruption. Thus, the cessation of the infinite is the problem posed by the inherently material nature of architecture. Nonetheless, the power of the identification of the Baroque with an operative function allows for a repetition of the Baroque beyond the setting provided for it by Kaufmann. Here there would be a repetition that pertained neither to form nor to system. Its link would be to the Baroque as a diagram. That is why it should be added, albeit parenthetically, that the identification of the Baroque with a form fails to allow for the possibility of the Baroque as a diagram, and thus as an operative function. Once this is the case, then images of the Baroque have to be used operatively. They have to be used as diagrams. Thus, they have to be viewed neither as representations nor as images. Precisely because the move to the diagram allows for the question of how material realization is to occur, that the severance of style and appearance as marking the modern can be identified as that question's conditions of possibility. Moreover, it is the abstraction of the diagram, its inherent immateriality, and this will be the case even if diagrams are constructed materially, that opens up an architectural history that displaces the centrality of the plan as the main organizing image, and allows for such a position to be given to the material event. Thank you.
Okay, we do have some time. Would anyone like to start a question? Do we have the microphone somewhere? Sorry, somewhere. Okay, there's a question at the back there.
Greeks as the distinctly modern moment. And I don't know Hübsch, but the period that you mentioned is of course the period of Romanticism across Europe. And the very blunt question would be, would you associate Romanticism in the arts in general, but also in literature and in philosophy, with that modern gesture that you describe in relation to architecture? And if that's the case, wouldn't we have to talk about another kind of imitation, or at least not relinquish completely the notion of imitation, but replacing the Greeks with nature? And so isn't there a different relationship that takes place, and a reworking of imitation?
I mean, it's very interesting is the debate as to relationship of Hübsch's relation to Romanticism. But I do think that at a certain moment, part of what emerges is this move to a type of internality, where what becomes, it's never, I mean, if you think about, as I would, you know, Benjamin's critique of Goethe, and Benjamin's critique of Goethe was that for Goethe, art could never be, was uncriticizable, because there was always an image, this Urbild, which was external to the work, and that the work was always a relationship between an externality and something which then showed itself internally. I think what you have with Hübsch, though this is why the dates become complicated as to who does what when, is that regulative relation vanishes. Therefore, the question of style emerges. And I think, though I don't know, I suspect one could then begin to question, though there will be some sort of chronological violence here, one could begin to question that other moments, to begin to see how that operates. I mean, the other one, though again it's a chronological violence, is when it's based on Bataille's interpretation of Manet, which I think is very interesting. I mean, the standard sort of redemptive interpretation of Manet's Olympia is to sort of say that being a prostitute's all right. You know, so the other is, well, you know, a prostitute could be a goddess. In other words, it's to interpret Olympia in terms of an opposition between the eternal and then the damned, the sacred and the profane. And what Bataille says about Manet's Olympia, and I think, for what it's worth, I personally think he's right, he says that she exists nulle part. She exists nowhere. There is no opposition that incorporates her, so there's no way of understanding that painting as either a fallen notion of ideality or the flip side of the ideal. And I think, and I would say, even though the dates are obviously going to be quite different now, what is interesting is that idea, and Bataille says again about Manet, and I think quite rightly, that Manet turned his back on history. And again, what I think I would want to interpret that is to say that really what's going on here is the possibility of creating appearances, that which is present, that are no longer regulated by an ideal or its impossibility. In other words, it's trying to position the problem as beyond that. Now, what then happens with architecture is, then this also happens if you think about the history of Schlegel. This is precisely what happens. Schlegel ends up being a nationalist, ends up recognizing that the problem of the external ideal not being regulating internality is that you need coherence. And this coherence is found then in the national question. But it's the very possibility of having to find coherence allows you to locate it in the work of matter, and therefore to ask a question of the relationship between material presence and almost architectural structural members. So, I mean, I think that my response is to begin to take certain moments within the history of European thought and painting and architecture, etc., to begin to see how this gets to be staged. Now, the reason why I'm very reluctant to concede that it's nature is that the other possibility, without sounding too much like an analytic philosopher, it depends what you mean by nature. And it depends, the way in which then nature would figure as an external regulator, and whether or not you'd view what's here as governed by nature, as referring to nature, so that the ground of judgment would be the relationship between what's produced and something external to it, nature. And I think, or there's nature, that sense of nature. There's also nature as organic forms. So it does depend slightly what's meant by nature. But no, I think nature goes because nature was part of one of the ideals. This doesn't have to be a question.
Do we have another? Could I ask a question, which really is this? I'm wondering if there's like a sort of underside to the question of the Greeks. I mean, in the sense that you use kind of Winckelmann on the Greeks as establishing a certain kind of ground, but it also seems to me that perhaps that ground is not at all kind of steady. If, for example, the Renaissance refers to a sort of regulative norm of the antique, clearly that antique is much more kind of Roman than anyone kind of would have thought then. And so by the middle of the 18th century, there's clearly a kind of divergence, in a sense, between the Greek and the Roman, which has effect. I mean, it's not just a sort of historical distinction, because it seems to me it has an effect on the two of them operating as a kind of ground or indeed as a regulative function. And indeed, some of the positions which Winckelmann gets pushed into, in a sense, are a kind of testimony to the fact that he himself was operating in a kind of very, I think, sort of conflicted position. I mean, it would simply be the other side of it.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm not absolutely. I don't know enough about, the Greeks versus the Romans. But what does interest me is I'm not absolutely sure. It's certainly in the 18th and 19th century. It's all about antiquities. It's not simply about. That's why the debate about polychromatic antiquities. The trauma was to discover the Etruscan, which then upset both the Roman and the Greeks' Greek sculpture and architecture functioning as ideal forms. So I think that it's certainly probably right about the Renaissance, but I think that the investment had to do with purity of form that was then identified in different sorts of places, and then troubled by. It's very interesting that Hoopsch writes at the same time as Hittorf writes his pamphlet on polychromatic antiquities. And it's precisely that particular moment that gives to pure form a coloured surface. And once you have a coloured surface, then what is problematized, whether it's Greek or Roman, I suspect, is the question of the purity of form. So that then the whole relationship is troubled by matter. But Hoops doesn't refer to the debate about polychromatic antiquities, but it would have been very interesting had he done so. But I think the reason why he doesn't, and I think the reason why, because he wasn't the only person to write a pamphlet called In What Style Ought We to Build, and all of the pamphlets, until Bertischer, are all concerned with, if you like, what is imitated is a formal possibility. And when Bertischer writes his response to this, what he argues is that sure, what's imitated is a formal possibility, but it's a formal possibility in the case of the ancients, here again the Greeks, done in marble or stone. So therefore the reason why we have to stop imitating them is why would you do in iron what can be done in stone? So that's the moment in which the real materialism or the real materialist theory emerges, when all of a sudden imitation gets bound up with a history of architecture linked to material possibilities. And that I then think a whole new thing begins to happen. And that's why, well, followed on, that's why Zemper becomes so interesting, because he then is linked to precisely the debate about polychromatic antiquities as he is in arguments about materials. This is clearly not...
Talk about materials, but doesn't the Baroque also open the question of metaphysics, especially in Leibniz?
Yes, yes, you're completely right. I mean, the Baroque does open the question of metaphysics, but I think then can you go back to my first slide? I mean, I'll say talk more about this slide tomorrow, but it opens the question of metaphysics, but in two particular ways. Imagine you're lying on your back, okay? You're lying between C and D. Okay, you're on your back between C and D. What do you see? I'll tell you what you see. You see a whole series of architectural geometric shapes, hexagons, all sorts of extraordinary things in the dome, leading up to a little space lit by natural light, in which there's a Christian symbol of the dove. Okay. Now there you have the metaphysics of Descartes, namely that the infinite nature of God cannot be represented. So when I talk about this, what it's worth, I describe that as the infinite of illusion. Namely that the internal geometry of the dome gives you the infinite nature of God, but as an illusion thing. It's captured by the natural light, the bird, and this interplay of forms taking you up there. So that's one metaphysical position. Now you're no longer on your back, you've stood up, and you're looking at the walls. What becomes interesting about the walls is that here you have what I would call a material infinite, namely an infinite which is much like a calculus, in which there's an infinite number of possibilities. These column relations, column wall bay relations shift, but they shift within a determined field. So there's a potential infinite, but it's always showing itself material. Now that's, I would argue, a different conception of the infinite. And interestingly, in terms of the building, that what, again, you're on your back. Okay, you're looking up, you've come down from the dome, you've gone past the honeycomb shapes, and what do you hit? You hit the entablature. And it's the entablature that gives you a version of Christian God that's not Gothic, there's no run straight to the top. It's the entablature which holds together these two conceptions of the infinite. So sure, it's metaphysical. The Baroque gives you metaphysics, but what it gives you is a far more complex metaphysics than simply metaphysics. What it gives you is an interplay between a way in which a building struggles, as it were, with two different, as it were, philosophical conceptions of the infinite. Now, we're not, in the 17th century, we're not particularly interested, unless we're architectural historians, in that as a problem. But you're a designer. Therefore, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because here you have two different theoretical ideational registrations captured in one object. So you have discontinuity. Discontinuity of the entablature gives you these two different worldviews, but it's done materially through the entablature, not done through a discursive blah 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 about the building. It's there in the solid stuff that holds it up. Equally, it's interesting for design because of the way in which this dense line is just full of information. So that line distributes the so-called elements of architecture. This line allows you to ask, I mean, years ago I remember the workshop when there was a surface furniture workshop, but the idea behind the workshop was make the furniture part of the surface, not, you don't put the furniture on the surface. Well, it's thinking about this line that allows you to see individuated elements, i.e. furniture, as continuous with other things. Now, that's the diagram, as it were, which I'll say more about, built into this.
You seem to sometimes treat the image, or the notion of the image, as a sort of like general idea, and I'd like to know like more in particular how you differentiate the image. I mean, do you differentiate as much as you differentiate the diagram, or as much you differentiate in a way the terminology of, I mean, where does basically your idea of copy starts, and where your idea of imitation or plagiarism starts?
Well, I think that what I do is run sort of, the standard argument that I presume now everybody does, and that's to say that, the diagram is that which carries a potential for representation but is not itself representational. Therefore, the question is, how do you make it representational? Now, therefore, because diagrams are inherently images are inherently overdetermined, we can read this as a historical document. We can show the way that Steinberg does, that the three permutations of the cross give you the convex, give you the ellipse and the circles, give you the equilateral triangles. They're the varying modalities of the way the cross operates, and so one would read this as a historical document, and that's one way of reading it. So what this does is enact or represent certain historical moments, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's called architectural history. But what is it possible to free this from its location in history? And that would come from refusing to read it simply representationally. And in not reading it representationally, there would be the question of another reading of it. And that is the condition of possibility for that, is the inherently overdetermined nature of images. That's why they can't simply be an image of something. They're actually not images at all. They become images by attributing certain qualities to them. So, and then blah, 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 blah. Then I will say more about this in the lectures, but that would be the general position about how to take plans and designs and not read them as plans and designs, but to read them as something else, to allow them to have other possibilities. Now, I'm particularly obsessed by this image and this picture of other people. But nonetheless, I think one can begin to make the same sort of arguments about other moments of